Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where relaxing narration turns historical disasters into a bedtime treat. You didn't blink when you gave the order to drown your brother. If this quietly cursed little channel helps you rest, and brings even a little calm to your busy life, then our efforts are worth every second it takes to make these daily videos. So please like, subscribe and leave a comment. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you over there. Your support goes a long way, and our appreciation for that is more than you could know. Tonight you watch your brother unravel, accuse, beg and fall, and you let him drown in a vat of wine so the paperwork stays clean. Later, you'll take the crown from your nephew's tiny head and pretend he was never born. Close your eyes. The room is still. The sound of my voice is all there is now. The fire crackles softly beside your bed, and the warmth of the blankets holds you still. Beneath it all, you feel the familiar pull, that quiet, steady tug, as sleep wraps around your ankles and draws you downward, down past the silence of Westminster, down past the secrets whispered behind velvet curtains, through torchlit corridors lined with polished stone, where servants don't speak and doors close quietly behind them. You remember the scent of beeswax and burgundy. You remember the splash, and now, in the hush of twilight, the tower waits. It's almost time. It was the summer of 1471, and Edward IV had achieved something remarkable. He'd run out of people to kill. The list of his enemies read like a memorial service programme. Henry VI, mysteriously dead in the Tower. Prince Edward, butchered at Tewkesbury. Warwick the Kingmaker, face down in the mud at Barnet. Margaret of Anjou sat in comfortable captivity, her fierce spirit finally broken by the loss of everything worth fighting for. The Lancastrian cause wasn't just defeated, it was extinct, as dead as the Latin it was sometimes written in. For the first time in his reign, Edward faced the terrifying prospect of having to actually govern rather than simply survive. The king's response to peace was characteristically Plantagenet. He celebrated by expanding in every direction possible. His waistline grew with the enthusiasm of someone who'd discovered that royal privilege included unlimited access to Burgundian wine and venison. His family expanded too, with Queen Elizabeth producing heirs and spares with mechanical efficiency. By 1472, the royal nursery contained 3 sons and 4 daughters, with more on the way because apparently Edward approached procreation with the same enthusiasm he'd once reserved for battle. The Yorkist succession seemed secure, assuming you didn't look too closely at the relatives. The Woodvilles had learned from their previous near extinction, and now multiplied at court with the determination of a species that had discovered the secret to survival was nepotism. Earl Rivers controlled the Prince of Wales's household, shaping the future king in the Woodville image. The Queen's brothers and sons from her first marriage accumulated offices like collectors acquiring rare manuscripts. Every position of influence that came available somehow ended up in Woodville hands, as if by magnetic attraction. The English nobility watched this colonization with the forced smiles of people attending their own funeral. Richard of Gloucester, the youngest York brother, had taken himself north after Tewkesbury with the relief of someone escaping a family dinner that had gone horribly wrong. He ruled from Middleham Castle with quiet efficiency, married Anne Neville, Warwick's younger daughter, because this family recycled everything including wives, and generally acted like the one adult in a family of overgrown children. The North loved him for his justice, his dedication, and his complete lack of interest in court pageantry. He was everything his brothers weren't, competent, loyal, and thin. George of Clarence occupied the uncomfortable middle ground between his successful brothers like a spare heir who'd never quite accepted his spare status. Edward was king, Richard was indispensable, and George was present. He'd been forgiven for his rebellion with Warwick, but forgiveness and forgetfulness were different things. His wife, Isabel Neville, brought him wealth and Warwick's legacy, but also the suspicious attention of a king who remembered betrayal better than he remembered birthdays. George began drinking more, talking louder, and making the kind of claims that suggested he'd forgotten that the Tower had vacancies. The peace of 1471-72 had a peculiar quality, like silence after a 30-year scream. Nobles who'd spent their entire lives at war discovered they had to find new hobbies. Some took up building, creating manor houses that were more palace than fortress. Others discovered the joys of litigation, fighting in court with writs instead of swords. The economy, freed from the constant drain of civil war, began to recover, with the surprised pleasure of a patient discovering they weren't actually dying. Merchants traded, farmers farmed, and everyone pretended they couldn't hear the foundation creaking. Edward's court became a perpetual celebration of his survival. Tournaments replaced battles, with knights competing to not kill each other for a change. Feasts replaced sieges, with courtiers besieging tables laden with enough food to feed the armies that no longer existed. The king presided over it all with the satisfied air of a man who'd won everything and intended to enjoy it. He'd earned this peace with blood, and by God he was going to wallow in it like a particularly content pig in particularly expensive mud. The financial situation of the crown was, creatively, disastrous. Wars were expensive, and Edward had fought several. Peace was also expensive when you insisted on celebrating it constantly. The crown owed money to Italian bankers, who were beginning to make pointed comments about repayment schedules. Parliament was reluctant to grant taxes, now that there wasn't a war to justify them. Edward's solution was typically innovative. If you couldn't tax your subjects, perhaps you could tax your enemies. Or better yet, get your enemies to pay you not to be enemies. Foreign policy in the early 1470s consisted mainly of Edward discovering that threatening war was almost as profitable as winning one. Louis XI of France, the universal spider, watched England's recovery with the concern of someone whose favourite chaos had suddenly organised itself. Scotland tested the borders with occasional raids, more from habit than hope. Burgundy, Edward's brother-in-law, made supportive noises that cost nothing and meant less. Everyone waited to see if English stability would last or if this was just an intermission in the usual programming. The domestic situation required delicate handling, which Edward approached with all the delicacy of a mace to the skull. Former Lancastrians needed watching but not provoking. Former rebels needed pardoning but not trusting. Current supporters needed rewarding but not bankrupting the crown further. The king's solution was to delegate everything boring to others, while focusing on the enjoyable aspects of monarchy, hunting, feasting, and fathering more potential claimants to confuse future historians. By 1473, patterns were emerging that would define the rest of Edward's reign. The king was more interested in pleasure than policy. The Woodvilles were more interested in advancement than administration. Richard of Gloucester was more interested in justice than court politics. And George of Clarence was more interested in wine than wisdom, a preference that would eventually prove fatal. The kingdom had achieved peace, but it was the peace of exhaustion rather than resolution. The absence of external enemies meant that internal tensions had space to grow. Without Lancastrians to unite against, Yorkists began remembering why they didn't actually like each other very much. The Woodville dominance created resentment that had nowhere to go except inward. George's disappointments fermented in alcohol and ambition. Richard's competence highlighted everyone else's incompetence, and Edward's contentment blinded him to the cracks spreading through his carefully constructed peace. Christmas 1473 was celebrated with particular magnificence, as if expense could purchase permanence. The court glittered with jewels and joy and barely concealed jealousies. Edward distributed gifts with the generosity of someone who believed his own propaganda about prosperity. Elizabeth presided over the festivities with the serene confidence of a queen whose enemies were all dead or irrelevant. The royal children were displayed like particularly valuable merchandise, each one a guarantee against future chaos. Nobody mentioned that guarantees in medieval England were worth about as much as the parchment they were written on. The new year brought new challenges disguised as opportunities. France was making interesting noises about peace. Scotland was making predictable noises about borders. The English nobility were making expensive noises about needing rewards for loyalty. Edward surveyed his kingdom like a man who'd won a prize he wasn't quite sure what to do with. He'd spent so long fighting for the throne that actually sitting on it felt anticlimactic. Peace, it turned out, was harder than war. At least in war you knew who your enemies were. But for now, in that golden summer of 1471, stretching into the uncertain years beyond, England exhaled. The kingdom without enemies discovered that the absence of war wasn't quite the same as the presence of peace. Edward grew fat on his victories. The Woodvilles grew bold on their security. Richard grew powerful in his northern fastness. And George grew bitter in his wine cups, fermenting grievances that would eventually overflow. The Wars of the Roses were over, everyone said. Everyone was wrong, but for a brief, shining moment, it was pleasant to pretend otherwise. By 1475, Edward IV had made a remarkable discovery. You could make more money by not fighting wars than by winning them. The revelation came to him gradually, probably somewhere between his third course at dinner and his fifth cup of wine. England was at peace but still poor. France was rich but still worried. And surely there was a way to transform French anxiety into English income. The solution was elegantly simple. Threaten to invade France with such conviction that they'd pay you to go away. It was protection money on a regal scale, conducted with banners and trumpets instead of broken windows and threats. The invasion of France in 1475 was one of history's great theatrical performances. Edward assembled the largest English army since Agincourt, complete with the latest artillery and enough nobles to start their own kingdom. The propaganda was magnificent. Here was England reclaiming its ancient rights, the heir of Henry V come to claim his French inheritance. The reality was more commercial. Edward had pre-negotiated with Louis XI about exactly how much it would cost to make him go home. Still, appearances had to be maintained, so the army crossed the Channel with all the pageantry of a conquering force that had no intention of conquering anything. The French king, Louis XI, understood the game perfectly. He'd spent years turning other people's aggression into his opportunity, and Edward's invasion was just another business transaction dressed in armour. When the English army arrived, Louis didn't prepare for battle, he prepared a banquet. The town of Picquigny was chosen for negotiations, featuring a bridge with a wooden barrier in the middle to prevent any unfortunate stabbing incidents during the talks. It was diplomacy designed by people who understood that the traditional end to medieval negotiations involved someone dead in a ditch. The meeting between Edward and Louis was a masterclass in mutual theatrical deception. They embraced through the barrier, like old friends who definitely never tried to destroy each other. Edward spoke of his ancient right to the French throne, with the conviction of someone reciting lines from a play. Louis responded with deep respect for English claims, and deeper pockets full of English gold. They negotiated like merchants at a fair, which is essentially what they were, just with better costumes and more hereditary titles. The terms were staggeringly generous, because Louis understood that paying Edward to leave was cheaper than fighting him to make him leave. Edward would receive 75,000 crowns immediately to cover his expenses, presumably the expense of not actually invading. He'd then receive 50,000 crowns annually for the rest of his life, a pension that made him one of France's best-paid employees. Additional sweeteners included a trade treaty that would enrich English merchants and a betrothal between their children that would never actually happen, but sounded nice in the meantime. It was the most profitable non-war in history. The English nobility's reaction to this mercantile triumph was decidedly mixed. Some, particularly those with Italian banking connections, understood that profit was profit, whether it came from plunder or pensions. Others, particularly those who'd spent fortunes equipping themselves for glorious battle, felt somewhat cheated. They'd come for war and glory and were being sent home with gift baskets and promissory notes. Richard of Gloucester was particularly disgusted, refusing to attend the final negotiations and making his contempt for the whole affair radiantly clear. The French went all out to ensure English satisfaction with the arrangement. The entire English army was entertained in Amiens with a generosity that bordered on the suspicious. Wine flowed like water, if water was extremely expensive and made you forget why you'd come to France in the first place. Feasts were laid on that made English cuisine look like the primitive barbarism it arguably was. French merchants offered special deals to their English counterparts, understanding that a bribed army was a peaceful army. Some English soldiers enjoyed French hospitality so much they had to be forcibly removed when it was time to leave. Edward himself was lavishly entertained by Louis, who understood that keeping kings happy was a sound investment. The French king showed off his wealth with the subtlety of someone making sure Edward understood exactly how much more was available. They hunted together, feasted together, and generally acted like monarchs who'd discovered that friendship was more profitable than enmity. Edward probably knew he was being bought, but being bought by France was better than being bankrupted by war. Besides, 50,000 crowns a year could buy a lot of Burgundian wine and velvet doublets. Back in England, the returning army was greeted with confusion rather than celebration. They'd left as conquering heroes and returned as well-paid tourists. The lack of battle meant no ransoms, no plunder, no glorious stories of English valour against French cowardice. Instead they had treaties and promises, and the kind of peace that merchants loved, but warriors despised. Edward spun it as a triumph of English diplomacy, conveniently not mentioning that the diplomacy mainly consisted of accepting bribes with royal dignity. The domestic impact of the French pension was immediately apparent in Edward's lifestyle. The king, already inclined toward luxury, now had the means to indulge every inclination. The court became even more magnificent, if that was possible. Tournaments grew more elaborate, feasts more excessive, the king's waistline more expansive. The crown's debts to Italian bankers were suddenly less pressing when you had French gold arriving regularly. It was fiscal policy by pension, and it worked surprisingly well. But not everyone was celebrating Edward's profitable peace. George of Clarence, already nursing grievances like fine wines, found new reasons for resentment. His brother was being paid by France while he received nothing. His wife Isabel had just died, in December 1476, shortly after giving birth, and George was convinced she'd been poisoned. The fact that childbirth was dangerous, and women died regularly from it, didn't factor into his calculations. Someone had murdered his wife, and in the absence of actual evidence, he was happy to blame everyone. Clarence's descent into paranoid madness accelerated with impressive efficiency. He accused Ancrette Twinehoe, his late wife's servant, of poisoning her mistress. Without waiting for anything as inconvenient as a trial, he had the woman dragged to Warwick, subjected to a kangaroo court, and hanged within hours. It was judicial murder conducted with the casual brutality of someone who'd forgotten that being a duke didn't actually make you above the law. Edward, busy counting his French gold, initially ignored his brother's behaviour. The Scottish situation provided a useful contrast to the French arrangement. Where France paid for peace, Scotland provided excuses for the kind of limited war that justified military expenses without risking actual defeat. Border raids were conducted with the enthusiasm of a sport both sides understood. The Scots would steal cattle, the English would steal them back, everyone would declare victory and go home. It was war as theatre, dangerous enough to maintain military readiness, but not serious enough to disrupt trade or Edward's French penchant. By 1477, the kingdom had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Edward grew fatter and richer. The Woodvilles grew more entrenched and more hated. Richard governed the north with increasing autonomy and competence, and Clarence grew madder and more dangerous, like wine turning to vinegar in a forgotten cellar. The French pension arrived regularly, funding a court that looked like peace and prosperity, but felt increasingly like a beautifully decorated powder keg. The irony of Edward's greatest diplomatic triumph was that it revealed everything wrong with his kingship. He'd discovered that being king could be profitable, comfortable, and require minimal effort. The warrior who'd won at Towton had become a merchant who sold peace for pensions. The young king who'd inspired loyalty through charisma and courage now inspired it through patronage and parties. It worked, for now, but it was building a kingdom on foundations of French gold and aristocratic resentment. Neither was particularly stable in the long term. Winter 1477 brought new complications disguised as old problems. Clarence's madness was becoming impossible to ignore. The French were making noises about possibly reducing the pension. The Scots were being more Scottish than usual. And Edward, insulated by wealth and wine, continued to believe that all problems could be solved with sufficient application of gold and good cheer. He was about to discover that some problems, particularly those named George, required more permanent solutions. George, Duke of Clarence, had always been the forgotten middle child of the York family, but by 1477 he'd found a way to make himself unforgettable through spectacular public madness. His wife Isabel's death had shattered something that was probably already cracked, like dropping an already damaged vase and then blaming the floor. The Duke's grief manifested not as quiet mourning, but as increasingly violent paranoia, the kind that involved accusing servants of witchcraft and having them executed before breakfast. It was mourning conducted with the subtlety of a mace to the skull, which was very on-brand for a Plantagenet. The execution of Anchoret Twino had been just the beginning of Clarence's judicial murder spree. He followed it up by accusing John Thursby of poisoning his infant son, though again the child had died of what looked suspiciously like being a medieval infant. Another servant was hanged for allegedly giving the Duchess poisoned ale, though nobody could explain why a servant would murder their employer and then stick around to be caught. George's version of justice operated on the principle that someone had to die for his losses, and servants were conveniently available and defenceless. It was grief processing at its most homicidal. But Clarence wasn't content with killing servants. He had bigger delusions to pursue. He began claiming that Edward IV wasn't legitimate, dragging up the old rumours about their mother's alleged affair with an archer named Blayborn. This was particularly unwise, as it suggested that if Edward was illegitimate, so was George, but logic had never been Clarence's strong suit. He started telling anyone who'd listen that he had a better claim to the throne than his brother. The fact that most people stopped listening after the first treasonous sentence didn't deter him. The Duke's behaviour reached new heights of self-destructive stupidity in 1477. One of his servants, Thomas Burdett, was arrested for casting horoscopes predicting the king's death, which was the medieval equivalent of posting assassination threats on social media. Burdett was tried, convicted and executed, which should have been a warning to Clarence to distance himself from treasonous servants. Instead, George burst into a council meeting at Westminster, had a priest read Burdett's Declaration of Innocence, and then stormed out. It was performance art, but the kind that ended with the performer's head on a spike. Edward IV had tolerated his brother's behaviour with the patience of someone who remembered they were family. But even fraternal affection had limits, and George had found them, exceeded them, and then set them on fire. The king finally decided that enough was enough, which, in medieval terms, meant someone was about to have a very bad time. Clarence was arrested and confined to the Tower in June 1477, joining the long list of people who'd discovered that being royal didn't make you immune to royal justice. The trial of George, Duke of Clarence, in January 1478 was one of history's most awkward family gatherings. Edward personally prosecuted his brother before Parliament, laying out a case that essentially amounted to George is too dangerous to live. The charges included plotting against the king, spreading rumours about Edward's legitimacy, and generally being an ungovernable menace. George defended himself with the eloquence of someone who'd been drinking heavily for several years, which is to say, badly. Nobody spoke in his defence, possibly because defending obvious treason was career-limiting. The verdict was never in doubt. When the king personally prosecutes you for treason, acquittal isn't really an option. Parliament condemned Clarence to death with the enthusiasm of people who understood which way the wind was blowing. But then came an awkward pause. Edward had gotten his verdict, but seemed reluctant to sign the death warrant. For weeks the king hesitated, possibly remembering when they were children, possibly calculating political consequences, possibly just procrastinating, the way people do when they have to kill their siblings. The Speaker of the Commons finally had to formally request that the sentence be carried out, which was Parliament's way of saying, either kill him or let him go, but stop dithering. Edward signed the warrant. On February 18, 1478, George, Duke of Clarence, met his end in the Tower of London. The exact method of execution became one of history's most persistent rumours, that he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, his favourite drink. Whether this actually happened or was propaganda is unknowable, but it was perfectly symbolic. George had drowned himself in wine for years, making it literal was almost poetic. The reaction to Clarence's death was muted, like applause at a performance nobody had enjoyed but everyone agreed needed to end. The nobility understood that George had brought it on himself with determination that bordered on suicidal. The common people, who'd suffered under various noble feuds, were just glad there was one less duke to worry about. Richard of Gloucester, the last surviving brother, maintained public silence, while probably thinking that being the only competent York brother was exhausting. The Woodvilles celebrated discreetly, understanding that one less royal brother meant more security for their position. Edward himself seemed more relieved than grieved. He'd removed a threat to his throne, but at the cost of becoming a fratricide, which was awkward even by medieval standards. The king threw himself into his pleasures with renewed determination, as if enough wine and women could wash away the memory of signing his brother's death warrant. The court continued its endless round of festivities, but there was something hollow about the laughter now. Everyone knew the king had killed his own brother. Everyone pretended it had been necessary. Everyone was probably right. The inheritance from Clarence was divided with unseemly haste. His lands and titles were redistributed among loyalists and family members. His children, Margaret and Edward, were quietly shuffled aside, tainted by their father's treason. Young Edward, Earl of Warwick, would spend most of his life in custody, guilty of nothing except having the wrong father and a claim to the throne. It was collective punishment for individual madness, but that was how medieval justice worked. The execution of Clarence marked a turning point in Edward's reign. He'd shown he could be ruthless when necessary, even against family. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone, particularly Richard of Gloucester, who understood that brotherhood was conditional on good behaviour. The Woodvilles took note that even royal blood wasn't protection against royal justice. Foreign observers reported that Edward had become harder, less trusting, more willing to use violence to solve problems. The fat, jovial king was still there, but underneath was steel that hadn't been visible before. The French pension continued to arrive, funding a court that danced on the grave of fraternal affection. Louis XI, ever the pragmatist, didn't let a little thing like fratricide affect business. If anything, he probably approved. A king who could kill his own brother was a king who understood necessity. The payments arrived on schedule, the trade agreements continued, and everyone pretended that England's stability wasn't built on French gold and brotherly blood. By the end of 1478, England had one less potential claimant to the throne, and one more dark secret in its royal history. Clarence was dead, drowned in wine or blood depending on whom you asked. Edward was secure, if security could be built on fratricide. Richard of Gloucester was now heir presumptive, a position that came with its own dangers. The Woodvilles were dominant, which meant they had further to fall. And somewhere in the tower, the ghost of George haunted his brother's dreams, probably drunk even in death. The kingdom had learnt that Edward's mercy had limits, that brotherhood wasn't protection, and that madness was a luxury even dukes couldn't afford. It was a lesson written in wine and blood, taught by a king who'd run out of external enemies and had started eliminating internal ones. The peace of England was maintained, but at a price that would echo through the remaining years of Edward's reign. You could kill your enemies and rule in fear. You could forgive your enemies and rule in love. But when you killed your brother, you ruled in solitude, no matter how crowded your court. The years between 1478 and 1483 were Edward IV's golden twilight, a period when the kingdom basked in the warm glow of a setting sun that nobody wanted to admit was setting. With Clarence pickled in his grave and external enemies either dead or bribed, Edward settled into ruling England with all the energy of a well-fed cat in a sunbeam. The king had discovered that peace was profitable, governance was delegable, and there was no problem that couldn't be solved by throwing money, Woodvilles, or Richard of Gloucester at it. It was government by inertia, and surprisingly, it mostly worked. Edward's physical transformation during these years was remarkable to behold. The young warrior who'd stood 6 feet 4 inches of muscle and menace at Towton had evolved into a monument to excess. His face, once handsome enough to charm widows into secret marriages, now resembled a pudding that had been left in the sun too long. His body, expanded by years of Burgundian wine and venison, required increasingly creative tailoring to maintain any semblance of majesty. Courtiers who remembered the athletic king of the 1460s now watched a man who got winded walking to his own feasts. The Woodvilles had transformed from upstart in-laws to the established power behind the throne. Earl Rivers controlled the Prince of Wales household with the efficiency of someone who understood that controlling the heir meant controlling the future. The Queen's son, Thomas Grey, Marquis of Dorset, accumulated offices like a collector who couldn't stop bidding at auctions. Every position that came available somehow found its way to a Woodville or Woodville ally, as if the family had developed a gravitational pull for patronage. The English nobility watched this continued colonization with the resignation of people who'd given up fighting the inevitable. Richard of Gloucester governed the north like a separate kingdom, which increasingly it was. From his stronghold at Middleham, he dispensed justice with a fairness that made him beloved by people who'd forgotten what fair governance looked like. His marriage to Anne Neville had produced one son, Edward of Middleham, a sickly child who represented the future of the only competent branch of the York family. Richard visited court rarely, and when he did, he watched the Woodville dominance with the expression of someone observing an expensive disaster in slow motion. The Scottish situation provided Edward with just enough military activity to justify maintaining an army without actually having to use it seriously. Border raids continued with the regularity of seasons, each side stealing cattle and burning villages with professional enthusiasm. In 1482, Edward finally roused himself to authorise a proper campaign, sending Richard to recapture Berwick. The Duke of Gloucester succeeded brilliantly, because he succeeded at everything, taking the town with minimal fuss and maximum efficiency. It was the last English military triumph of Edward's reign, achieved by the only York brother who still remembered how to win battles. The French pension continued to arrive with beautiful regularity, funding Edward's increasingly expensive tastes. Louis XI, the universal spider, had got an excellent value for his money. England was peaceful, distracted, and no threat to French interests. The annual payment of 50,000 crowns kept Edward in wine and the kingdom in artificial prosperity. French merchants had favourable trading terms, French diplomats had favourable hearings, and everyone pretended this wasn't bribery on a national scale. It was foreign policy by subscription service, and Edward was a satisfied customer. Domestically, the kingdom operated on autopilot with surprising efficiency. The law courts functioned, mostly honestly. Trade flourished, especially with the Low Countries where Edward had negotiated favourable terms. The nobility had settled into a routine of local governance and court attendance that didn't require royal intervention. Edward had discovered the secret of successful medieval kingship: delegate everything boring and keep the ceremonies. He excelled at the ceremonial aspect, presiding over feasts and tournaments with genuine enjoyment. The succession seemed secure with an abundance of heirs. Edward, Prince of Wales, was approaching his teenage years, surrounded by Woodville uncles who shaped his education and outlook. His younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, provided the essential spare. The king's daughters were parcelled out in marriage negotiations like particularly valuable trading cards. The royal nursery was full, the succession was clear, and everyone assumed this meant stability. Everyone was wrong, but optimism was more comfortable than accuracy. But beneath the surface prosperity, cracks were spreading like frost on glass. The Prince of Wales was being raised as a Woodville puppet, educated by his uncle Rivers in Wales, far from any non-Woodville influence. The young prince was reportedly intelligent and promising, but he was also isolated and entirely dependent on his mother's family. His younger brother lived with him, creating a convenient package of royal heirs under Woodville control. Richard of Gloucester watched this arrangement with increasing concern, but maintained his northern focus. Edward's health, undermined by decades of excess, began showing signs of strain. The king who'd once led from the front now led from the table, if he led at all. Governance increasingly devolved to whoever was nearest and loudest, which usually meant Woodvilles. The king's seal was applied to documents he barely read, authorising decisions he barely understood. It wasn't tyranny or incompetence exactly, it was absence. A king present in body, but increasingly absent in spirit. The court culture of the early 1480s reflected its king. Gorgeous, expensive, and slightly rotting underneath. Tournaments continued with decreasing martial credibility and increasing theatrical spectacle. Feasts grew more elaborate, as if quantity could compensate for the growing staleness. Courtiers competed in displays of wealth that bankrupted estates and enriched merchants. It was prosperity as performance art, convincing as long as you didn't look at the books too closely. The Christmas festivities of 1482 were particularly magnificent, as if Edward sensed this might be his last chance to play the generous monarch. The Great Hall at Westminster groaned under the weight of food that could have fed half of London. Wine flowed in quantities that would have impressed even Clarence's ghost. The king presided over it all with the bonhomie of someone who'd confused being fat and happy with being secure. Nobody mentioned that the king looked unwell, that his colour was bad, that he struggled to stand for the toasts. International observers noted the strange quality of England's peace. It was prosperous but precarious, stable but not secure, peaceful but not united. The French ambassador reported that England was like a beautifully decorated house with foundation problems. The Burgundian agents noted the Woodville dominance with concern, understanding that the Queen's family had no natural support base. Everyone could see the problems except the English, who were too busy enjoying the peace to notice its fragility. The early months of 1483 brought unseasonably cold weather and the king's increasingly erratic health. Edward had always been robust, able to drink anyone under the table and then lead a hunt the next morning. Now he tired easily, his famous appetite decreased, and he spent more time in his chambers than his hall. The Woodvilles managed access to the king with increasing control, filtering who saw him and what business reached him. Richard of Gloucester remained in the north, whether from duty or prudence was unclear. By March 1483, the false spring was clearly ending. The king's health was failing faster than anyone wanted to admit. The succession, so carefully secured with multiple heirs, suddenly looked vulnerable with those heirs in Woodville hands. The prosperity built on French pensions and avoided wars felt as substantial as morning mist. And everyone began that careful political calculation that preceded every royal death. Who would rise, who would fall, and who would survive the transition? Edward IV had achieved something remarkable. He'd given England over a decade of peace and prosperity. But he'd built it on personal charisma rather than institutional strength, on bribery rather than reform, on exhaustion rather than resolution. The kingdom worked as long as Edward lived to make it work, through sheer force of personality and French gold. Without him, it was a beautiful machine with no one who understood the controls. The false spring had been pleasant while it lasted, but winter was coming, and England was about to discover that peace was only as permanent as the king who'd purchased it. In early April 1483, Edward IV went fishing, which seemed harmless enough until he came back with a chill that would reshape English history. Or perhaps he suffered a stroke at one of his endless banquets, his body finally rebelling against decades of excess. Or maybe, whispered the conspiracy-minded, French agents had decided their pension payments were becoming too expensive. The stories multiplied like mushrooms in damp darkness, but the result was singular. Within 10 days, the 40-year-old king was dying, and England was about to discover what happened when you built a kingdom on one man's personality. Edward's deathbed was crowded with the kind of people who suddenly remembered how much they'd always loved the king. The Woodvilles clustered around their meal ticket with the desperation of people watching their power source flicker. Nobles who'd spent years resenting royal policies discovered deep wells of affection for royal favour. Priests offered last rites with the efficiency of professionals who'd done this before and would do it again. And somewhere in the dying king's fading consciousness, the realization dawned that he'd failed to secure the one thing that mattered, his son's throne. The king's last attempt at statecraft was typically Edward. He tried to reconcile everyone through sheer force of deathbed charisma. He made Lord Hastings and Marquis Dorset shake hands, which was like making fire and water promise to get along. He begged the nobles to protect his children, apparently forgetting that asking medieval nobles to protect royal children was like asking wolves to babysit sheep. He named his brother Richard as Lord Protector, then added a council of Woodvilles to assist, creating a government designed for conflict. It was peacemaking by a man who'd run out of time to make it stick. Edward IV died on April 9, 1483, leaving behind a 13-year-old heir, a grasping widow, an ambitious family of in-laws, and a brother who'd spent the last decade in the north avoiding exactly this situation. The king's body was barely cold before the political scrambling began. The Woodvilles controlled London, the treasury, and, most importantly, the new king Edward V, who was conveniently 200 miles away at Ludlow with his uncle Earl Rivers. Richard of Gloucester was even further north at Middleham, perfectly positioned to be cut out of power if he didn't move fast. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth Woodville, understood that her power evaporated the moment her son was crowned and could rule independently. Her solution was elegantly simple: delay the coronation until she could pack the government with enough Woodvilles to make their removal impossible. Earl Rivers was instructed to bring the young king to London slowly, very slowly, with an armed escort large enough to discourage interference. The Royal Council, dominated by Woodville allies, set the coronation for May 4, giving them just enough time to entrench their position permanently. But Richard of Gloucester hadn't survived decades of medieval politics by being slow to react. The moment news of Edward's death reached Middleham, he was in motion. Letters flew to his allies, particularly the Duke of Buckingham, who nursed his own grievances against Woodville dominance. Richard proclaimed his loyalty to his nephew Edward V, in terms so flowery they practically dripped nectar. Then he rode south with the speed of someone who understood that, in succession crises, whoever controlled the king controlled the kingdom. The race between Richard and Rivers would have been comedic if the stakes hadn't been mortal. The Rivers moved the young king from Ludlow with the stately pace of a funeral procession, which, given subsequent events, was ironically appropriate. Richard rode south like the experienced military commander he was, calculating distances and intercept points with mathematical precision. Buckingham joined him with forces and enthusiasm, happy to support anyone who might diminish Woodville power. The two forces were converging on history, though only one side knew it. The interception at Stony Stratford on April 30 was masterfully executed. Richard arrived all smiles and brotherly affection, greeting his nephew with the warmth of a loving uncle who definitely didn't have ulterior motives. He expressed shock at the size of the royal escort, wondering aloud why the king needed so many armed men. Rivers, caught between suspicion and protocol, made the fatal error of accepting Richard's hospitality. By morning, Rivers and the other Woodville escorts were under arrest, accused of plotting against the Lord Protector. Young Edward V woke to find his uncle Richard was his new best friend, whether he liked it or not. The journey to London became a careful dance of legitimacy. Richard needed to appear as the loyal uncle, protecting his nephew from evil counsellors, not as the ambitious duke seizing power. Edward V, intelligent enough to understand something was very wrong but young enough to be powerless, played along with the dignity of a king who had no other options. The Woodville escort was dismissed, replaced by Richard's men who were definitely there for the king's protection. Messages sent ahead proclaimed the Lord Protector's devotion to his nephew and his determination to see him properly crowned. In London, Elizabeth Woodville received news of her brother's arrest with the practical understanding of a woman who'd survived one civil war. She gathered her younger son and her daughters and fled to Westminster Abbey, claiming sanctuary with the speed of someone who'd done this before. It was April 1483, almost exactly 20 years after she'd fled to the same sanctuary from Warwick's rebellion. History was repeating itself with depressing accuracy, except, this time, the threat came from within the royal family. The capital received Richard and Edward V with the confused enthusiasm of people who weren't quite sure what they were celebrating. The Lord Protector proclaimed his devotion to his nephew in every public forum. The young king was lodged in the Tower for his comfort and security, of course. The royal apartments there were luxurious. The view was excellent, and if the walls seemed unusually thick and the guards unusually numerous, well, that was just proper protection for a monarch. Everything was perfectly legitimate if you didn't think about it too hard. The coronation was rescheduled for June 22, giving Richard time to consolidate his position. The Woodville-dominated council was purged with surgical precision. Lord Hastings, Edward IV's old friend, initially supported Richard against Woodville dominance. The Duke of Buckingham, thrilled to finally matter, threw his support behind the Lord Protector with unseemly enthusiasm. The machinery of government shifted from Woodville control to Richard's management, with the smooth efficiency of a coup conducted entirely through legal channels. But controlling the government wasn't the same as securing it. Young Edward V was still king, would still be crowned, would still eventually rule independently. The Woodvilles were wounded, but not eliminated. The Queen Mother in sanctuary was a rallying point for opposition, and somewhere clerks were dusting off genealogies and marriage records, looking for impediments to a child king's legitimacy. It was amazing how many impediments you could find when you looked hard enough with the right motivation. By late May, London was thick with rumours and thin on certainty. The young king remained in the Tower, joined now by his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, whom Richard had convinced Elizabeth to release from sanctuary. The two boys were seen playing in the Tower gardens, shooting arrows at targets and probably wondering when they'd be allowed to leave. Their uncle Richard managed the kingdom with increasing confidence, issuing orders in Edward V's name that Edward V had never seen. Everything was perfectly normal, except for the growing sense that it wasn't. The transformation from Lord Protector to King Richard III would take only a few more weeks, but the groundwork was already laid. The king was secured, the government was controlled, the opposition was scattered. All that remained was to discover a reason why Edward V couldn't be king, and medieval England was never short of reasons when someone powerful enough needed them. The machinery of usurpation was in motion, grinding forward with the inevitability of ambition dressed in legal procedures. England held its breath, waiting to see which king would emerge from the confusion. Would it be Edward V, the boy in the tower waiting for a coronation that kept being postponed? Would it be Richard, the Lord Protector, who protected so thoroughly that his nephew might never need protection again? Or would it be someone else entirely, waiting across the narrow sea for the Yorkist dynasty to finish destroying itself? The kingdom had asked, "Long live the king," but nobody was quite sure which king they meant anymore. Richard of Gloucester's transformation from Lord Protector to King Richard III in the summer of 1483 was a masterpiece of legal choreography performed on a stage built from other people's bones. The opening act came in June, when Bishop Stillington, who'd been conveniently silent for 20 years, suddenly remembered that Edward IV had been pre-contracted to marry Lady Eleanor Butler before his secret wedding to Elizabeth Woodville. This made Edward's marriage to Elizabeth invalid, their children illegitimate, and the throne conveniently available to the next legitimate male heir. The fact that Eleanor Butler had been dead for 15 years and couldn't confirm or deny the story was probably just fortunate timing. The revelation spread through London with the speed of scandal, which is to say, instantly. Parliament, presented with this shocking information, clutched its collective pearls and declared all of Edward IV's children bastards, with the grave solemnity of people who knew which side their bread was buttered on. The Lord Protector protested, oh how he protested, that he couldn't possibly accept the crown. The burden would be too great, the responsibility too heavy, the honour too much for a simple duke. Parliament insisted. Richard reluctantly accepted. Everyone pretended to believe this performance, because the alternative was admitting they were watching a coup in real time. The princes in the Tower, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, watched their legitimacy evaporate from the windows of their luxurious prison. They'd been moved from the royal apartments to more secure quarters, for their protection, of course. Their servants were dismissed and replaced with men who answered to their uncle. Their movements became restricted, their visitors non-existent, their future increasingly theoretical. The boys were seen less frequently in the Tower gardens, their archery practice abandoned, their childhood ended. Richard III's coronation on July 6, 1483, was a splendid affair that couldn't quite hide the empty spaces. The new king and his wife, Anne Neville, processed through London with all the pageantry money could buy. The crowds cheered with the enthusiasm of people who understood that not cheering was inadvisable. The nobility attended in force, having made the practical calculation that supporting a present king was wiser than defending absent princes. But there were no young princes in the royal box, no nephews to witness their uncle's triumph. Their absence was louder than any accusation. Through the summer of 1483, the princes faded from view like a painting left in sunlight. They were seen at the windows less frequently, their faces pale against the stone. Servants reported that they were well, then that they were ill, then stopped reporting anything. By autumn they weren't seen at all. The Tower, which had housed so many inconvenient royals, had swallowed 2 more. Nobody asked where they were, because everyone knew that asking was dangerous and knowing was worse. The theories about what happened to the princes multiplied like rumours in a plague year. Richard had them murdered, obviously. He had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. Or Buckingham did it, either on Richard's orders or his own initiative. Or they died of natural causes, because medieval children did that with depressing regularity. Or they escaped and lived as farmers in France, because people needed hope even when it was obviously false. Thomas More would later describe midnight murders with pillows, Shakespeare would add artistic flourishes, and historians would argue forever. What's certain is that by the end of 1483 the princes were gone. Richard III ruled a kingdom built on the absence of two boys who should have been king. He issued proclamations about justice and good governance, while everyone wondered about the justice of nephews disappearing. He reduced taxes and reformed laws, while people whispered about reformed succession through murder. He was, by many accounts, trying to be a good king. But good kingship built on dead children was like a cathedral built on sand, impressive until you looked at the foundations. The kingdom's reaction was muted, like applause at a tragedy everyone had seen coming. The nobility, exhausted by decades of civil war, accepted the fait accompli with weary pragmatism. The commons, who'd suffered through the Wars of the Roses, just wanted stability and didn't much care which king provided it. The church, always flexible about divine right when circumstances demanded, confirmed Richard's legitimacy with holy oil and selective amnesia. England had a king. The fact that he'd probably murdered children to get there was unfortunate, but not unprecedented. But silence isn't the same as acceptance, and absence creates its own presence. The missing princes haunted Richard's reign like ghosts at a feast. Every law he passed, every reform he instituted, every act of good governance was shadowed by two boys who weren't there to see it. Mothers looked at their children and thought of other mothers who'd lost theirs. Nobles who'd accepted necessity began calculating alternatives. And across the narrow sea, Henry Tudor suddenly looked less like a desperate claimant and more like a possible solution. Richard spent the winter of 1483-84 trying to rule normally, as if normality was possible when built on disappeared nephews. He travelled the kingdom, dispensing justice and royal favour. He confirmed privileges and pardoned offences. He acted like a medieval king was supposed to act, except for the part where he was supposed to have not murdered his predecessor. The administration functioned, the laws were enforced, the kingdom operated. But it was governance in a vacuum, missing something essential. The Tower of London stood silent through it all, keeping its secrets behind stone walls. The rooms where two boys had played were empty. The gardens where they'd practiced archery grew wild. The windows where they'd watched the world stayed dark. Somewhere within those walls, two princes had vanished into history's greatest unsolved mystery. Or perhaps it wasn't unsolved at all. Perhaps everyone knew exactly what had happened but preferred the comfort of uncertainty to the horror of certainty. As 1483 turned to 1484, England slept uneasily under its new king. Richard III ruled, but his crown sat on a throne built from silence. The princes were gone, but their absence was more present than their presence had ever been. The Tower kept its secrets, the kingdom kept its peace, and everyone kept pretending they didn't know what they all knew. It was survival through collective amnesia, governance by agreed-upon fiction. The Wars of the Roses hadn't ended, they'd just paused to swallow two more children. Soon, Henry Tudor would land with French gold and Welsh dreams. Soon, Bosworth Field would settle accounts written in royal blood. Soon, the Tower would have new prisoners and new secrets. But for now, in the winter of 1483, there was only silence where princes should have been. Sleep well, Edward the King who never was. Sleep well, Richard of York, the spare who wasn't spared. Wherever you rest, in the Tower's foundations, in a forgotten grave, in the dreams of guilty men, sleep well. England has moved on, as England always does, stepping over the bodies of children to crown the next king. The Tower keeps its secrets. The Thames flows on, carrying away evidence and innocence alike. And in the morning, there will be a new king, a new day, and new crimes to forget. Good night, lost princes. Good night, England. The kingdom exhales once more, pretending not to notice it's been holding its breath since two boys stopped appearing at the windows. Sweet dreams if you can manage them. The Tower is quiet now. Good night. Thank you for listening, one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace.